2024 is drawing to a close, and it's time for the New Arab Voice's customary roundup of the biggest stories from the year. This week, we've gathered journalists and editors from across the New Arab's newsroom to look back on the events that made 2024. My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to the New Arab Voice. "2024 started in a customary fashion with January. Less customary was the Israeli drone strike that targeted Salah al-Aruri in the southern suburb of the Lebanese capital of Beirut. New Arab journalist Louay Faour joined me in the studio to remind us who Salah al-Aruri was.
Salah al-Aruri was one of Hamas's seniors. He was considered the group's number 2. He was one of the founding commanders of the group's military wing, the Azz al-Din al-Qassam brigades, and he had other senior roles in Hamas. On the 2nd of January this year, an Israeli strike assassinated Salah al-Aruri south of Beirut in the city's southern suburbs. And it was the first attack on the area since the Gaza war, and fighting with Hezbollah simultaneously erupted in October the previous year.
How much of an impact, did this have on, let's say, the axis of resistance? Hezbollah has a strong presence in the south of the capital, but obviously he is a Hamas operative, I think is the right word. So, how much of an impact would we say this had?
I mean, it was definitely a major escalation since the war had begun in October. This happened in Lebanon, and for Hezbollah, which was the group that was engaged in the fighting with Israel, it definitely crossed a red line, or what had been known as the rules of engagement between Hezbollah and Israel. And Beirut, with its southern suburbs, were considered a red line. But Israel had warned it would go after Hamas commanders anywhere and everywhere. It didn't really impact Hezbollah, but it did show that Israel was willing to go to great lengths to achieve its military goals. And it certainly hurt Hamas. I mean, it was the beginning of something very dangerous that Israel was going to sort of unleash on the so-called axis of resistance in the region.
Not wanting to be left out, the US and UK launched their own airstrikes. Their air offensive targeted the Houthis in Yemen. Senior editor Nada Osman explained why.
Since Israel launched its war on Gaza, the Houthis have been targeting ships travelling through the Red Sea trade route, which they say are linked to Israel. And this has all been in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. At the moment, around 45,000 Palestinians have been killed in the enclave. So these strikes on ships have caused significant delays and disruption to shipping and trade. They've driven up costs and insurance, and they've forced companies to take much longer routes around the Horn of Africa. And in some cases, it's taking companies around 2 weeks to complete a journey when it could have just taken a day or so. So the US and UK in turn said that they've conducted joint airstrikes against Houthi targets. They're saying, of course, it's to protect the free flow of commerce, but they've also called it an act of self-defense. And I think we all know that, the US and UK have Israel's interests at heart, but there's no doubting that the Red Sea connects Europe to Asia and East Africa, so it's very immensely important.
Were these airstrikes effective? Did they prevent or stop the Houthi attacks on trading ships?
In short, no. It's currently December and they're still going. And I think the Houthis are far more spread apart. They're savvy and well-prepared than a lot of people think, especially considering the way that they've confronted Saudi Arabia over the years. And the Houthis also know that there's very little support for the US and UK strikes if Yemen is targeted. And targeting these shipping vessels actually will work in their favour because it will kind of garner them more regional support, especially because, of the ongoing war on Gaza and their anti-Israel stance. They're one of the few countries that are standing up to Israel currently. So it's safe to say that, these attacks had kind of like an opposite effect of what the US and UK wanted, but the Houthis in turn managed to kind of seriously dent Egypt's Suez Canal revenue and closed quite a few factories in Europe, actually.
As the US and UK were starting fresh action in Yemen, Israel was dealing with business from the previous year and the case against them at the International Court of Justice at The Hague. Analysis editor Charlie Hoyle remembered events.
So this was a really defining moment, I think, in terms of international justice and especially related to the war on Gaza. On January the 26th, the International Court of Justice ruled on a number of interim measures requested by South Africa as part of its genocide case against Israel. The ICJ found it plausible that Israel's actions could amount to genocide. It also ordered provisional measures such as preserving evidence of crimes, ensuring the transfer of aid to Gaza, and preventing and punishing incitement to genocide. The case was launched at the end of 2023, and so really there was a lot of anticipation about the ICJ's initial ruling, at least the provisional ruling in January, and effectively they took on South Africa's case, they listened to the evidence, and they found plausible evidence that Israel was committing acts of genocide in Gaza.
Plausible acts of genocide in Gaza is a strong determination by the court. How did Israel react to such an accusation?
So, South Africa presented reams and reams of evidence for their case. Some of it included news articles, some of it included testimonies from rights groups. A lot of it included statements from Israeli ministers themselves. I think we can all remember at the beginning of the war, after Hamas's attack, Yoav Gallant, was kind of famously videoed saying, they're going to cut fuel, they're going to cut aid, they're going to cut water. We are not dealing with humans, we're dealing with human animals. All these kind of statements built the case that there was, intention as much as action in terms of the deaths as part of the military campaign. Israel has completely rebutted, the accusations. They say they're engaged in a legitimate war of self-defense, even though that has been disputed itself. So it's a huge blow for Israel's reputation internationally and some measure of justice for Palestinians in Gaza.
It probably goes without saying that one of the biggest stories of the year was Israel's ongoing war against Gaza. With so much tragedy coming from the enclave and at such a relentless pace, it's difficult to pick the biggest stories from the year. One story that did cut through at the start of the year were the funding cuts suffered by the Palestinian relief organisation UNRWA. Journalist Oliver Mitzi explained.
In January, Israel claimed and handed documents with evidence to the US and a number of other countries, saying that initially 12 staffers were involved in the Hamas-led 7th of October attacks. That was later raised to 19 staffers. Many donors, international donors, cut their funding or suspended funding for a time, which prompted a UN investigation into the issue. We now have the results of that investigation. So the UN investigation into the issue found that there was a possibility of involvement of 9 of the staffers that were accused, and they were also dismissed at the time, but that the remaining staffers lacked evidence for those accusations, and one had no evidence at all. As the year went on, more and more international donors started resuming funding, but that does not include the US, which is the agency's biggest funder, and will not continue funding until at least March 2025 because of the legislation that passed through Congress.
I think just worth saying, obviously accusations against 12 members of staff resulted in 9 dismissals. This is an organisation that employs tens of thousands of people?
Well, yeah, thousands at the very least.
Yeah.
And also the organisation hands lists to Israel of all of their employees, all of their staffers as well.
Going back to the initial suspension, which countries suspended funding, and then what impact did that have for the delivery of aid, particularly at a time when it was needed so much?
Yeah, so the US halted funding, as well as the UK and Germany, amongst others.
Those are the biggest ones,
Those were the biggest ones, exactly, yeah.
the real issue at the time was that UNRWA did have the funds, but for a limited period. So there was going to be a point in which, if they didn't get extra funds from said donor countries or from other countries who could raise said funds for the organization, then it would have to cease operations. And this came at a time when there was lots of concern, and there still is lots of concern about this issue, but there was lots of concern about famine proliferating across the Gaza Strip as well as in the north. And to be honest with you, those conditions haven't really changed.
So has the funding been resumed now? You say not by the US.
Not by the US,
not
but
till 2025.
not
but
by the US.
The UK, Germany, other nations.
Yeah. All other nations have resumed their funding. They didn't do it all at once, but they slowly began resuming funding as the months went by. Yeah.
In February, the US struck back against Shia militias in Iraq and Syria in retaliation for a drone strike that had killed 3 US servicemen in Jordan the previous month. Associate Features editor Zainab Mehdi explains.
At the time, the US military reported that it struck more than 85 targets, including command and control centers, intelligence hubs, rocket and missile storage, unmanned aerial vehicle facilities, as well as logistics and munitions supply chain sites belonging to these militia groups.
These are Shia militia groups.
Yeah, the Shia militia groups and their sponsors in the IRGC.
Also in February, as the onslaught in Gaza continued, elsewhere in Palestine, the government was collapsing. Oliver Mitzi again.
The issues that caused the collapse was the war in Gaza, as well as the continued escalation by both Israeli settlers as well as the Israeli military in the West Bank. So Mohammed Shtayyeh, who was the prime minister, resigned. And he cited those issues specifically and said that a new government needs to form that can actually deal with said problems. And so Mohammed Mustafa took his place and was appointed by Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority.
I mean, these are difficult times for the Palestinian people as a whole. Obviously, a very difficult time for also the Palestinian government, despite, I think, there are many faults which have been documented widely. What does this mean for the Palestinian government? I mean, can it continue in its current form, and maybe particularly in the face of such Israeli oppression?
Well, this is the thing. The Palestinian Authority as it exists at the moment is at the behest of the Israeli government and Israeli government policy towards the occupied West Bank. So it seems like the international community wants it to continue, but in a reformed way, because Mahmoud Abbas, there's lots of accusations that he is very corrupt and he has a personal circle around him. And these discussions happen within the Palestinian Authority as well as within the international community. But in terms of it existing in the future, it all depends on Israel and the Israeli government policy towards the PA. There have been plans to undermine the PA by certain ministers within the Israeli government, including Bezalel Smotrich, the far-right finance minister. And he himself has tried to stop tax revenue going to the Palestinian Authority and attempted to de-link the Palestinian and Israeli banking systems as well. So it's a real issue, but there's not really much the Palestinian Authority can do, in the sense that they could reform, but
only with the permission of Israel.
Well, yes, but also it doesn't really matter if they reform or not. The buck ends with Israel, right?
Continuing with February and Palestine, an unimaginable tragedy took place in Gaza in a year where every day has been an unimaginable tragedy. This particular tragedy became known as the Flower Massacre.
The issue of aid in Gaza is basically that not enough is getting in. And so there was an aid convoy that was traveling to North Gaza, which is separated from the rest of the enclave by the Netzarim corridor. And they ended up at the Al Rashid roundabout. in the north. And because of the severe damage to Gaza's infrastructure, aid distribution often is a very messy process. And so, crowds of people were gathering around to get flour from these aid trucks, flour obviously being a key component for bread. And basically, Israeli soldiers began opening fire on the crowds, and it caused a stampede. At the time, the Israeli military denied that they had fired on crowds, but accounts from Palestinian hospitals and doctors working in said hospitals were both sharing images as well as giving testimony of bullet wounds in many of the victims. And there was also quite a bit of video that came out of the scene where you could clearly hear gunshots and people running as well. The Israelis actually released drone footage, although there were accusations that this drone footage was edited. And then later on, they admitted that the soldiers had opened fire on the crowd, although that was because Palestinians were coming close to the soldiers and they posed a threat to the soldiers. But yeah, 118 people, at least 118 people were killed and around 750 were wounded in the incident.
Was there any sort of international reaction to this and to anybody sort of pointing culpability at Israel?
So it saw condemnation from states such as Germany, Qatar, and Turkey, and many other states in the West called for an impartial investigation and for accountability. It also generated quite a bit of media buzz as well. So CNN at the time did an investigation into the massacre and basically concluded that actually, yes, Israeli soldiers had fired based on the video clips that were shared on social media, as well as accounts that they had from people on the ground who were there as well. So it did generate quite a lot of buzz within Western media and saw governments condemning the incident as well.
2024 was the year of the election. Barely a month went by without some democratic action, and the Middle East didn't miss out on the opportunity, although its democratic credentials were often questioned. First up to the ballot box were Iranians for legislative elections. Opinions editor at the New Arab, Benjamin Ashraf, explained.
Normally elections in a theocracy are pretty drab affairs, and normally the Iranian leadership is always torn between wanting to appear legitimate on the one hand and remove loyal critics and whilst trying to get people to vote. And they didn't, basically. Only 25 million people participated, and that translated to a 40% or 40.64 for it to be pedantic as a turnout. Interestingly, even in Tehran, the capital itself, that number plummeted to 24%.
That is low.
That is low, and it reflected the general mood on the ground. On the streets of Tehran, basically people were saying, look at the markets, look at the bazaars, and we want officials that take actions and not campaigns. And when you have kind of a manufactured election like that, it's to be expected. Nonetheless, there were key issues in the election, and you need to remember that Iran is still suffering from severe economic sanctions after the nuclear deal collapsed imposed by the Americans. And in March, at the time of the election, inflation was about 45%. And also, on top of that, we can't forget the open wound that was the 2022 Mesa Amini protests that were still kind of hanging over Iranians. So, that was the general context and perhaps reflects why turnout was so low.
I'm assuming that the regime perhaps didn't react well to this. So, how did the regime react to both the results and the turnout?
Yeah, I guess when you have a regime that is is kind of characterized by double speak and new speak and all kind of Orwellian strategies, it tried to gloss over the fact that turnover was so low. And it's interesting, actually, because you saw you see a lot of the hypocrisy of the Iranian regime. Ayatollah Khamenei had previously actually criticized Western democracies for low voter turnout, including literally saying that 40% voter turnout was shameful. in this case, he actually he said that the Iranian 40% turnout was a remarkable epic move. He did so whilst planting a sapling of an olive tree for Palestine. So very much when you're listening to people on the ground in Iran, when they say we want basically actions and not campaigns, Khamenei didn't really read the message by trying to live up to kind of the symbolic gestures that he did.
Hot on the heels of Iran was Turkey, who went to the polls for local elections. Our editorial and social media assistant, Charlotte Hockey, ran through the winners and losers from the vote.
So there were different winners in that, and one big loser, so to speak. The clear winner came out to be the CHP, the Republican People's Party, led by Özgür Özel. So the major victories for that party was that it regained control of Ankara, it retained control of Istanbul, and it secured a historic victory in Izmir after 47 years. And it also made unexpected gains in traditionally conservative strongholds, so to speak, like in Adıyaman, southeast Turkey, just like reflecting a growing discontent towards the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, Erdogan's party.
Who are more conservative. Mm-hmm. What would we say this means for the future of Erdogan, current president of Turkey?
So the municipal and the municipal losses, and also especially in urban centers, are a clear warning sign for him. It shows that the dense populations in those urban areas are very discontent with his economic policies, and those areas have traditionally been very pivotal in Erdogan's political dominance. If those economic issues and discontent that might lead him to lose some of its broader like support bases in the conservative areas
at the next presidential election.
That's right.
At the end of 2023, Egypt held an event that was described by officials as an election, and in April of this year, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was sworn in as president. Again. New Arab journalist Salma Bouguera explained further.
The election results saw Abdel Fattah el-Sisi win a third term, securing an overwhelming majority. However, voter turnout was notably low, with reports indicating a figure around 30%.
Oof.
I mean, this highlights ongoing concerns about the political environment in Egypt, where opposition voices have been stifled, and public confidence in the electoral process remains questionable.
Along with a crisis with public confidence, Egypt also has an economic crisis ongoing and plenty of financial problems. Just days after Sisi was sworn in, the EU pledged €1 billion in financial aid. That's an awful lot of money. Was it enough to help pull Egypt out of its financial problems?
I mean, that was a short-term aid. I mean, it was a step, but it barely scratches the surface of Egypt's deep economic crisis. The country is still grappling with foreign currency shortages, soaring inflation, and the fallout from geopolitical tensions. While the aid is part of a larger €5 billion package, it comes with conditions, including progress on democratic reforms and human rights. I mean, the reality is that these funds alone can't and won't stabilize the economy without significant structural reforms and wider international support.
Following the flower massacre in February, international attention was dragged back to Gaza in April with another Israeli airstrike that targeted much-needed aid.
So these were a series of airstrikes, or rather drone strikes, on a 3-car convoy from the World Central Kitchen, which is an aid organization that was providing, and is still providing, food to displaced Palestinians within the Gaza Strip. The 7 people that were killed include 3 British nationals, as well as 1 Australian, 1 Polish and 1 US-Canadian national, and a Palestinian as well. They had taken items to a warehouse, and then when they left the warehouse, the 3 cars, an Israeli drone struck 3 cars one by one. As one was struck, the car stopped. They took the wounded or killed. And then the process happened again and again, basically. World Central Kitchen at the time said that they had notified the military of the movement of the vehicles. Like the Flower Massacre, this also generated a lot of condemnation, including from the government officials from the respective governments whose nationals had been killed. And it also generated, once again, a lot of media attention. In the UK, it took up headlines, front-page headlines, in major national newspapers, and
which the war in Gaza has not done consistently.
Only a few times.
All this throughout this year. Yeah.
Only a few times, yeah. At the time, World Central Kitchen said they would stop their operations in the immediate aftermath of the strike. They have resumed since then, but it was quite a difficult moment for the aid situation in Gaza, because it wasn't just World Central Kitchen that said that they would suspend. A number of other organisations said that they will have to at least evaluate, if not suspend, their operations.
As Gaza dealt with unending tragedy, Libya was grappling with its own crisis and the missing central bank governor, Sadiq al-Kabir.
He was abducted by an unidentified group. The reason behind his kidnapping remains unclear, but it appears in the context of rising tensions around the central bank of Libya, including armed sieges and disputes over the bank's leadership. Militia groups were reportedly pressuring for the resignation of Sadiq al-Kabir, the governor, over his management of all revenues and fiscal policies. This suggests the kidnapping could have been part of a broader attempts to exert control over the bank's leadership.
Libya is currently famously split between East and West governments. The kidnapping happened in the west of the country, but it does impact the east of the country. So how did the East respond to this?
So the Eastern administration, aligned with Khalifa Haftar, condemned the leadership changes at the CBL. They saw them as illegitimate. In retaliation, Haftar's forces ordered a halt to oil production and exports in the east, significantly impacting Libya's oil output, which dropped to less than half of normal levels. This blockade intensified the economic and political crisis, as most of Libya's oil fields are in the east under Haftar's control.
Fears and tensions were ratcheted up in April with airstrikes and retaliations between Israel and Iran. It started when Israel targeted Iranian assets in the Syrian capital of Damascus. Charlie Hoyle again.
So the Israeli attack was in Iran's consulate in Damascus. It killed at least 7 Revolutionary Guards officers, including Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahedi, who was the highest level Iranian official to have been killed since Qasem Soleimani in 2020. So this was a highly significant moment. Zahedi, for example, commanded units in Lebanon and Syria. He was kind of crucial connecting point between Tehran and Hezbollah and the then President Bashar al-Assad. I think analysts at the time really thought this was an unprecedented escalation by Israel against Iran in Syria. Many saw it as shifting the conflict's rules of engagement. Obviously, Israel has been bombing Syria for years, especially trying to prevent arms supplies to Hezbollah or pushing Iranian groups away from the border. But this was really a shift in its strategy, maybe one that they, in the end, miscalculated.
And rather predictably, Iran responded to this attack. Benjamin Ashraf.
Yeah, the sentiments ended up matching what ended up happening. So they said that the response would be decisive, and there was general international condemnation, but Iran did respond. They launched dozens of pilotless aircraft at targets across Israel, firing ballistic missiles, in fact, an hour later, with Iran's, as I mentioned, regional allies, so Hezbollah, the Houthis, firing rockets also at Israeli positions in the occupied Golan Heights.
How many missiles, how many drones, how big was this attack?
So now the dust has settled. The initial reports were that over 200 had been fired, but yeah, we're now aware that 170 drones and 150 cruise and ballistic missiles were fired at Israel from Iranian soil. Notably, the infamous hypersonic so-called Fateh cruise missile and the Ghada 110 were the Iranian picks, and it seemed to be a kind of a multi-pronged approach to try and gauge or perhaps overwhelm Israel's famed defense systems, the Iron Dome and David Sling, etc. And so that was why they used such a variety of different missiles and attack approaches.
It didn't seem like it caused, complete devastation to Israel. Many of them were shot down. Was this a success? Do you think?
Well,
would we say this was a successful attack?
Yeah, the New Hour have covered this quite in depth as usual, and it seemed to be the case that Iran had told its allies in the region a week prior, and the intent wasn't to harm its civilians, but rather to kind of, as I said, gauge the extent of Israel's defences and also try and damage infrastructure, which by and large it didn't. And so, to quote Ali Veyers, who's the director of the Iran project at the ICG, the International Crisis Group, Iran's retaliation was designed to be flashy but not fatal. But of course, the attack held symbolic weight, and Iran attacking Israel on its soils rather than using its proxies. Is a big thing.
During the couple months that preceded May, fears grew that Israel was preparing an invasion of the southern city of Rafah. And in May, those fears became a reality.
This offensive started in the beginning of May. It started with small incursions. And then, like the initial invasion of Gaza back in November 2023, and then it ramped up into a full-scale invasion. The Israeli offensive onto Rafah crossed over a quote-unquote US red line, which, whilst not formal, had been speculated about because of comments that President Biden had said in an interview prior, saying that this was a red line, even though he did walk back on the red line part. And we were hearing from senior US officials that the Israelis should not go into Rafah. But it happened anyway. One of the main issues with this offensive was the fact that so many of Gaza's displaced, which is essentially most, if not all, net people in the Gaza Strip now, were in the Rafah Governorate.
They've been pushed from further and further south.
Because Rafah hadn't been bombed as much as Gaza City or Khan Yunis or other areas of the Gaza Strip. Many were in Rafah. There was still housing available, and if people couldn't get housing, then obviously they pitched tents and other things like that.
And how big was this offensive? I mean, we've obviously, we've seen further north in the Gaza Strip very big offensives by the Israeli military. There was a sense, I remember, prior to this that it would be more limited, or certainly a bit more scaled back than what we'd previously seen. Was that the case, or was it more of the same?
I mean, it was more of the same. They attacked into Rafah and they took Rafah. Now, they have since stayed in the Philadelphia corridor, but at the time, they went systematically through Rafah during this offensive, in the same way that they did in Khan Yunis, in the same way they did in Gaza City and its surrounding camps and urban areas as well.
As 2024 progressed and Israel's war in Gaza continued in the brutal fashion that it had started the year, Netanyahu's government looked closer to home and to stifle any criticism.
So in April, the Israeli Knesset passed a law that allowed the government to temporarily shut down foreign media outlets if they were deemed to be a threat to the security of the State of Israel. The following month, the Israeli cabinet then unanimously voted to shut down Al Jazeera in the country, ordering the closure of its offices and a ban on the company's broadcasts, including a ban on its website in Israel and in occupied East Jerusalem. You could say this was maybe the culmination of a wider crackdown against the press in terms of its coverage of the Gaza war. Al Jazeera has, lots of brilliant journalists on the ground in Gaza who had really been bringing the cruelty of the war to an international audience. Prominent journalists such as Wael al-Dadou, who's for example, he lost his son, he lost his daughter, his wife, his grandson. I mean, Palestinian journalists have paid an enormous cost reporting on Israel's war on Gaza, and Israel hasn't allowed any foreign media into Gaza. So Palestinian journalists primarily, but also international outlets that they work with have become a vital source of information. So this was an attempt to censor the war in terms of international audience.
2024 was full of shocking moments, but May threw up one story that was as shocking as it was unexpected and had some far-reaching repercussions.
It feels a bit like a footnote in the year's events now,
Yeah.
but it was at the time quite a seismic event. And so what happened was that Ibrahim Raisi, who was the late Iranian president, and the Iranian foreign minister and 6 other senior officials were killed in a freak helicopter accident over northwestern Iran near the Azerbaijani border. They'd originally been opening a dam with, Raisi and his convoy had originally been opening a dam with his Azeri counterpart. And on their return leg, they encountered heavy fog over a mountain range that traverses the two countries. Fog that had previously been warned about by the Iranian Meteorological Society, and they were killed. It was interesting again when we're talking about, I guess, how Iran reacts to certain major events that the newspeak starts to come out. And I remember at the time, for the first couple of days, it was described as a hard landing, and eventually it was confirmed that they had been killed.
When these sorts of things happen in Iran, there's generally an air of suspicion around these sorts of things. In the immediate, so you mentioned about a hard landing, but what else was the immediate reaction? Who was anybody, individual or any country, blamed?
Yeah.
And these sorts of things foster conspiracy theories and suspicion at foreign nations. Were there any of those floating around at the time?
Let's start with the fun stuff. Let's start with conspiracy theories. And I was looking at the Iranian and Israeli Twitter feeds quite extensively during that period. And so I24, which is a French-Israeli news channel, they took a more, I guess, humorous route by saying that the man behind the attack was a guy called Helicopter.
Nice.
Whereas in Iran, they were a bit more somber and the idea or the belief was that actually that it was orchestrated by Raisi's rival in the presidential race, and it actually comes down to do with the succession, and that's a guy called Mujtaba. But I guess beyond the conspiracy theories, the actual reality of it was that that Raisi and his convoy were flying in an antiquated US aircraft that was first flown in 1968, and if anything, the whole debacle. It shows the effects of US sanctions, really. These US helicopters that had been purchased prior to the Iranian Revolution can't be maintained, there's no parts or whatever. So it does put into question why the Iranian president was flying on it, or why they didn't heed the advice of the Meteorological Society. I think the main thing to take from it is the effect on US sanctions and the hazardous conditions and the awful weather that they chose to fly under.
As we entered the summer months, local tensions in Turkey began to snap as riots spread across the country, with frustration and anger being directed at the country's Syrian population of 3.5 million. Charlotte Hockey again.
So the riots in Turkey were sparked initially in Kayseri.
It's in the east of the country.
In the east of the country. Those riots were sparked by reports of a Syrian man allegedly sexually abusing a 7-year-old Syrian girl. But the victim was later confirmed to be Syrian. The initial reports framed the incident as involving a Turkish child, which obviously wasn't true and enraged a lot of people. And it kind of fueled underlying tensions and xenophobia, anti-Syrian xenophobia going on. In general, anti-Syrian hostility in Turkey has been rising due to economic changes, like inflation and employment rate. And so that the community has been now scapegoated and has been given the blame for the country's struggles in general.
There were very serious riots. I mean, fires were started. There was violence, large groups of people. How did the Turkish authorities react to these outbreaks of unrest?
So at first, they condemned any form of violence. The interim minister, Ali Yerkaya, he criticized the riots, stating that damaging Syrian owned properties and inciting violence in general it went against Turkey's human values and kind of discouraged more the xenophobic attacks. To ensure that no violence would keep on going, the Turkish police, arrested exactly 474 people for their participation in the riots. And so those were kind of an effort in restoring order to hold the perpetrators accountable. But the sentiment is still there.
Summer brings the hot weather, which can suddenly be pleasant. But for Hajj pilgrims this year, it proved deadly. Nada Osman recaps.
So Hajj this year actually turned out to be quite devastating. Temperatures went up to around 51.8 degrees Celsius, that's 125 degrees Fahrenheit, and 1,300 people died, which is actually, it came as a bit of a shock because this year around 1.8 million pilgrims took part, which is not actually the highest number. I mean, pre-COVID, we saw the amount of people, we saw it go up to around 2 or 3 million. So it's not the highest number ever recorded. But again, the temperatures were very, very hot. And I think one thing to bear in mind this time around is that, of course, Hajj is compulsory for every Muslim who's physically and financially able to do so. And some people save up their whole life to be able to go. But getting visas to Hajj is very, very difficult. And it's allocated through a quota system and then distributed through a lottery. But this year, around 400,000 people, unregistered pilgrims, took part. Most of them were from Egypt. So yeah, these people were just not accounted for, and the really high temperatures didn't help either.
So, I mean, Saudi Arabia is notoriously a rich country. People are paying, as you say, a lot of money to go on Hajj. Why then was there not better infrastructure to deal with the people and to deal with the temperatures, so that there was water and shade and air conditioning and things like this? What happened? What went wrong there?
So again, 83% of those people that died were unauthorized pilgrims, and they had to walk very long distances under direct sunlight, which means that they had no buses to kind of shuttle them around and no proper shelter. And Hajj is already a very, very strenuous activity. It's a lot of walking, a lot of standing on your feet. So again, in some cases, a lot of these people struggled to get access to even hospitals or ambulances when they needed them.
Because they were unregistered.
Exactly. There were also some reports of tour groups promising to deliver essentials like water and food and then failing to do so. So I think that was another issue as well. What was quite interesting, I would say, is Saudi's response to this. They appear to blame pilgrims rather than take responsibility. In one statement, they said that the state did not fail, but there was a misjudgment on the part of people who did not appreciate the risks. And again, the Saudi health minister described the management of Hajj this year as successful. So yeah, and I think it would be wrong not to mention climate change here. Yeah. Temperatures moving forward are only going to get hotter. So Saudi Arabia really needs to take this seriously in the coming years and do their part to, make it more possible for people to complete their Hajj safely.
And as tensions reached deadly levels in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, the Houthis were taking the fight to Israel.
They joined forces with the Islamic resistance in Iraq to target 4 ships at the Haifa port. And this, again, was in solidarity with Palestinians being bombarded by Israel. Their spokesperson said that this specific attack was due to cargo ships belonging to companies that were either carrying military equipment or had violated the ban on entering ports of occupied Palestine. That's what they said. And the Houthis, after the attack, they said that their strikes were accurate and were in response to Israeli massacres in Rafah, which we've seen quite a lot of this year.
That was part 1 of our recap of the year. Next week, we'll bring the year to a close with part 2. This episode was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge, and featured Louis Faure, Nada Osman, Charlie Hoyle, Oliver Mitzi, Zaid Ahmeti, Benjamin Ashraf, Charlotte Hoquet, and Salma Bulgaria. Our theme music was by Omar Phil. You can find us on social media with the handle @TNA Podcasts for additional content. And you can also email us, podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.